everyone, and welcome to Storytime with Jocelyn. Today is part 4 of Hocus Pocus, and we are going to finish the book today. Aren't you excited? Let me put out a disclaimer also that Hocus Pocus does have some spooky elements, some witches, some eating of the children, and things like that. So if you have not seen the Disney movie, I would suggest asking your parents if it's okay to listen to the story. If not, parents, be advised this book is probably for 10 years and older. So let us get into it, Jocelyn. Are you excited? Let's find out what happens at the end of Hocus Pocus. And if we remember correctly, the witches were getting ready to fly. And let's find out what happens. Because they are always getting ready to fly. So, we are on chapter, like I said, Come We Fly! So let us begin. Allison began to stir, which woke Max from one of the deepest sleeps of his life. "Hi," he said to her, unable to hide a smile. She smiled back. "Hi," she said sheepishly. She picked up the clock near her hip. "Oh my God," she said, "it's 5 o'clock. My parents are going to kill me. I should go." She leaped up and grabbed her sweater. Max stretched. "I wish you could stay," he said. Allison looked at him. At first, a worried look passed over her face. She was unsure of what he meant and where he wanted this to go, but his droopy grin made her relax. "Hey," Max said, strengthening as he woke more fully and realized she was worried not only for being out so late, but about being out late with a boy. "We'll figure it out together, okay? You could say Danny got sick on sugar and I needed help. Danny will vouch for you. Plus, my parents saw us together out in public. They know we weren't, Maybe I'll say the girls kidnapped me as a prank," Allison said thoughtfully. Max nodded. Allison would know best, he realized, but it made him wonder if she didn't want her parents to know about him at all. Maybe he'd misread her again, and she didn't really like him back. Or maybe she did, but she was embarrassed about him. He got to his feet and stuffed his hands into his pockets. "I'll walk you back," he offered. Allison glanced at Danny, who was still asleep. The dark carving line of a black cat was pressed against her cheek. "Poor Binks," Allison said. Max looked at him then too. "Yeah, poor Binks," he said, thinking of their conversation at the park. He couldn't imagine being separated from his family for so long. Danny had meant well when she said a dozen generations of Dennisons would look after him. But Max knew that her promise wasn't much comfort to Thackeray Binks. "We owe him a lot," Max added. Allison nodded. "Look," he said, "can we find some kind of way to help him?" Allison thought about this proposal. "The book," she said. "The witches used it to put the spell on him. Maybe there's a way in there to take it off." She dropped her sweater on Max's cluttered desk and walked back to the loft staircase where she plopped down on the bottom step. "I don't know," said Max. "Binks told us not to open it." Allison picked up the spell book. Every time she picked it up, it seemed to get heavier. "But the witches are dead," she said. "What harm could they do?" Max nodded, thinking that over. "Well, just be careful." "I will," Allison said, smirking. She undid the clasp and strapped the cover closed, then reached for Max's arm. "Hold my hand," she said. He did, happily. Allison took a breath and lifted the cover. She skimmed the first page, which included a list of names she assumed belonged to the former owners of the book. Glenada Arden, Adelina Arden, Isadine Fitzroy, Matilda Percardi, Eve and Amiss, and Frances Harvey, and then Cecilia Sanderson, Emma Sanderson, and Drusilla Sanderson, Winifred Sanderson, and last, Elizabeth Sanderson. That's odd, Allison said, examining the final name on the list. She ran a finger over it. What is? Max asked. The last name on the list isn't Winifred's, she said, shaking her head. She turned to the first page of spells. Max leaned forward to rest his chin on her shoulder. Nothing here so far, she said, flipping to the next page. Winifred Sanderson left the window of her childhood home and dragged the tired body to a fainting couch in the corner. This was the same chaste upon which her mother had birthed her and each of her sisters, quietly and all alone, as was a witch's way. Mary and Sarah, even the two imprisoned boys, watched as Winifred settled herself onto the fainting couch and began weeping into her hands and ash-streaked skirts. The sun would rise soon, and she expired in her small house alongside her helpless sisters. And then what? The thought made Winifred sob even harder. She was afraid to go back to the place filled with fire and brimstone and catty witches. Of course, to go to no place at all. The idea of death chilled her to her marrow. "Oh, Winnie," said Mary gently, "do you want to hit me?" She knelt and placed a hand on her sister's wrist. "Would that cheer you up?" Winifred battled her hand away, and Mary signed, strengthening. She helped Winifred put her feet up. "There you go," she said, plucking up a fan and opening it to wash some fresh air over Winifred's face. "This is the end," said Winifred. "I feel it." "No," Mary said reassuringly, pumping the fan with more gusto. But Winifred didn't believe her. No, Winifred knew that she would draw her last breath in the same house wherein she drawed her first. "We are doomed," Winifred insisted. "I feel the icy breath of death upon my neck." The thought made her sick. She'd always been destined for more than these four walls. She'd been destined for greatness. Her tea leaves had always said so, which meant something. Winifred thought even if she nudged the leaves around once or twice to properly decode them. "Mary!" She looked daringly, as if she couldn't see her sister right next to her. "Take me to the window. I wish to say goodbye." She struggled to rise, and Mary hurried to help her. "Goodbye, goodbye, cruel world. Goodbye to life." Winifred reached the open window and leaned heavily on the sill. Mary worried not even the house's sturdy foundation could keep her sister on her feet. "Goodbye to all of that," Winifred said sadly. As she did, she noticed something in the distance and strengthened. "Sister!" she said, reaching for Mary's arm. "Observe!" Over the dark treetops, near a full, heavy moon, shone a thin beam of reddish light. "They opened it!" Crowd Winifred, energy pumping back into her body. "Aha! Just when our time was running out. Come, we fly!" She dragged Mary to the closet. Sarah trailed behind them. Their own brooms were gone, leaving only a few objects meant for cleaning left by the humans who had turned their beloved house into a shop. Winifred, who was the first to look inside, snatched up the only broom. Sarah took the mop, holding her nose at the smell, and Mary fused over the upright vacuum. "What about us?" Ernie called after the witches' retreating backs. Jay hushed him, but not before Sarah turned to them with a snarling, cannavating smile. "Oh, we'll have plenty of time for you," she said. She blew them a kiss as she followed her sisters through the front door. Allison, who was becoming impatient with the number of spells in the huge book, turned to a new page. "Oh, listen to this," she said, happy to have found anything useful at all. "Only a circle of salt can protect thy victims from thy power." There was a yawn, and Binks leaped onto Max's lap and shoved the book shut. He climbed on top of it to keep Allison from reopening it, then hissed at Max and Allison in turn. "We were just trying to help you," said Allison. Binks battered at her shoulder. "Well, don't," he said. "Nothing can come good from this book." He turned to swat at Max's face. "You got it?" With that, he leaped down and padded back over to where Danny was sleeping. Max looked apologetically at Allison. "Maybe we should go now," he said. She hesitated before nodding. "Okay," she agreed, sounding disappointed. She set the book back on the loft staircase and followed Max out of his room. "Come on," he said. "I'll walk you home." And that is the end of that chapter. The next chapter is, "Come, little children, I'll take thee away." Max peered into one of the other rooms, accessible from the upstairs landing. "Mom?" he called. "Dad?" He turned back to Allison, shrugging. "They're still not home," he said. "That's weird. Must be having a great time." "I don't know," Allison said, leading the way downstairs. "Something's not right. I'd feel a lot safer walking home if you had some salt." Max led her into the narrow kitchen. The only window was set over a steel sink, and the cherry-patterned curtains were drawn back to let in a little moonlight. The space was clean, but not yet unpacked. Boxes were stacked unopened against one wall, and Max suspected that they would be for a while. "My mom's not much of a cook," he said apologetically, swinging open a set of white-painted cabinet doors and climbing onto one of the tiled counters to inspect the highest shelves. "Sounds like my kind of lady," Allison jerked and joked. "When I'm an adult, the only thing I want to make are chocolate chip cookies." "Milk or dark?" Max asked. "Dark," said Allison, as if the answer were obvious. "No, oh, no way," said Max. "They're cookies. You gotta go milk." Max found a spare canister of salt behind a bunch of sugar packets and spices that the previous homeowners had forgotten. He made a triumphant sound and tossed the paper cylinder to Allison. Then he dropped down to sit on the same counter she was leaning against. Allison turned the counter over in her hands, then paused and smirked. "What's it you say?" Max asked, leaning in. He noticed that Allison smelled like green apples and cinnamon. Allison glanced at him, then back to the canister. "It says, form a circle of salt to protect against zombies, witches, and old boyfriends." "Yeah?" Max asked. "And what about new boyfriends?" As she studied his face, Allison's lashes fluttered against the tops of her cheeks. Max noticed the quirk of a smile around the corners of her mouth, so he leaned forward. He skimmed the dip of her hip and lip right below her nose, and he felt his paws kick up to a dangerous RPM. A crash! Jocelyn thundered down the stairs, and both Allison and Max pulled away and looked at the ceiling. "Danny?" Max breathed. He jumped up from the counter just as Allison pushed off towards the stairs. On his way up, he checked his jeans for reassuring weight of his dad's pocket knife. "Daddy!" Max called as he rounded this upstairs landing and barreled back into his bedroom. Danny had pulled the covers over her head, her hair just poking out from the top. Max exhaled with relief and tossed his coat on the floor. "Max!" Allison said, "The book is gone!" He walked toward the narrow staircase and led to the loft. Sure enough, the book had disappeared. Allison snatched his wrist. "I'm telling you," she said, "something's weird." Max hurried over to his sleeping sister and yanked back the covers. "Danny, wake up," he said. But it was not Danny in his bed. Sarah Sanderson sat bolt upright, beaming. "Trick or treat!" Allison shrieked and leaped away, and Max back toward the closet, but his plantation doors accordioned open. Mary and Winifred Sanderson strode out, both grinning. Winifred clutched the spell book, its patchwork front cover facing him. Mary had one hand around Danny's mouth and another around a large knitted sack. "Looking for this?" Winifred demanding, waving her book. "Or this?" Mary asked, tightening her fingers around Danny's face. Max looked from Danny to the book and realized Binks was right. The spell book was dangerous, and it must have somehow betrayed them. Even as he thought this, the strange pucker of skin on its cover shivered a little and then opened, blinking barely. It was an eye. And by the looks of it, the thing had been cut from a person's face. Max shouted with disgust, stumbling away. Winifred raised her free hand and hit him with a bolt of white lightning. Max flew into the air and crushed into his drum set. Cymbals and drums were everywhere as he collapsed. Allison popped the sock open and began to shake it wildly around the room. "Sots!" said Winifred. "Ha! What a clever little white witch." Allison banished the container at her. "But it will not save thy friends," Winifred continued. "No! Come, sisters!" She plucked up her skirts and started up the stairs to the loft. "The candle's magic is almost spent, Jocelyn. Dawn approaches." Mary followed her, still clutching a struggling Danny. Sarah trailed after them both, looking for Max's prone body to Allison. She gave the girl a dark look, then struck out her tongue and hurried after her sisters. Danny bit down hard on Mary's finger. "Let me go!" she shouted when the witch had freed her mouth. "Put me down!" Winifred launching lightning at the small window. The wall exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke that turned from pink to gray to green. The blast knocked Allison off her feet and sent a cascade of wood boards down the stairs. Allison pushed herself back up and dashed for the stairs to the loft. "Danny!" she called between coughs. But the witches had flown away, and they'd taken both the spell book and Max's little sister with them. Allison turned back to Max and shoved the snare drum off his chest. "Max, are you okay?" She helped him up. He blinked grudgingly. "Where's Danny?" Winifred gave a joyful shout as she led her sisters across the night sky, the three of them soaring high above Salem. The world below was full of so much more light than when she'd last been alive, including a slender lighthouse north of town that emitted a steady revolving beam. And yet it felt familiar and wonderful to have wind whipping through her curls and over her ankles, and to have the smell of salt and frightened children in her lungs. "Use thy voice, Sarah," Winifred called over her shoulder. "Fill the sky, bring the little brats to die." Sarah peeled off then, veering down so her words would carry the preposterous ears. Even from her height, though, Winifred could hear the sweet strains of Sarah's voice. "Come, little children, I'll take thee away into a land of enchantment. Come, little children, the time's come to play here in my garden of magic." The sound of Winifred's mouth with the taste of her mother's maggot apple pie. It was the treat she had always asked for on her birthday, both because she loved the sweet fruit and the flaky crust, but because she loved to watch her mother's hands powdered with flour as she crimped the edges and wove the top crust together with quick, practiced fingers, pressing the wormy creatures back into the sugary goo before they could wiggle their way out. Winifred clutched Danny's small body tighter. "My mother could not live forever," she whispered into the girl's ear, "but I'll make sure her rightful daughters do." Danny squirmed and wingled like a maggot herself, but Winifred's heart was full and warm, and her teeth were ready for the crunch of crystallized sugar on a buttery crust, or for the roasted knuckle buttery's balls bones of a tow-headed girl, whichever Mary wanted to prepare first. Max and Allison picked their way into the loft and looked out over Salem's dark streets. It was nearly 6 a.m, but kids were out in hordes, some of them holding candles and others carrying flashlights, and some empty-handed. A few of them were still in costumes, though the majority were pajamas and nightgowns. All of them walked as if transfixed. They headed south in a silent, scruffing crowd. "They're going to the Sanderson house," Allison said, watching the scattered throng snake up the road and out of sight. "Hey!" Max shouted down to the sleepwalking children. Allison grabbed his arm. "It won't work," she said. "Hey!" he yelled again, ignoring her. "Don't listen to them!" But just as with the adults at the pumpkin ball, nothing seemed to get their attention. Allison shook him. "Max," she said. "Max, I figured it out. Winifred said the candle's magic will soon be spent and dawn approaches. The black flame candle only brought them back for this one Halloween night. And unless they steal the lives of children when the sun comes up, they're dust." "Yeah?" Max said, turning to her. "But how can we make the sun come up? And they've got Danny. We need a miracle." Allison gave him a helpless look. She looked back at the road and flickering warmth of candles, flashlights, dawning the eerie scene. "I have an idea," she said. "Can you drive?" "Hi, everyone. This is our Binks." She's a little mad because she doesn't like to be held. But say hello to our Ellie Luna. That's her name. She's ready to go. But we wanted you to meet our Binks. Happy Halloween! Anyways, let's finish our story. You can tell we're in different clothes. We had a little incident, and Jocelyn was just not having it, so we're going to finish today. So let us begin where we left off in Hocus Pocus. Allison wants, they know where they are at the Sanderson house. Max wants to save Danny, of course, and Allison tells Max that she has an idea and wants him to drive. So here we go. The candles in the Sanderson house flickered low, and they yellowed wax softened and dripped down iron, hoarders, and wooden furniture in low, slick rivets. "Can you pick the lock?" Jay asked Ernie. "My knit's at home, man," said Ernie. He looked across the room at his friend. "Jay," he said, "I'm scared." Jay was scared too, but he knew he couldn't admit it. He was 2 months older than Ernie, and he was supposed to look out for him. So he said, "I won't let those hags eat you, Ernie. They might eat me, though," he thought. "But if he didn't, he'd be a better person. No more creeping girls. No more breaking things that didn't belong to him. And no more stealing chips from the gas station." That last bit had always made him feel bad anyway. His parents ran a small business, too, the groundskeeper's service for the historical lighthouse on Winter Island, and he knew how, though, it could be to get by. The boys groaned in unison when Winifred and Mary Sanderson returned, this time with Max Dennison's mouthy little sister in tow. Mary spent several minutes tying Danny to a chair before turning to the cage boys with a convenient grin. Winifred, meanwhile, opened her massive spell book and got to work. With a spark from her fingers, the fire beneath the cauldron leaped back to life. Jay and Ernie protested as Mary pressed chocolate bars and gummy worms between the bars of their cages. "No more candy," said Jay weakly. "But we've got to fatten you up," said Mary. "We should first eat the girl," said Winifred, almost absently, as she leaned closer to the simmering potion she'd been preparing for half an hour. "Otherwise, she'll start to spoil." She and Mary and Danny looked up, when the weather front door creaked open, Jay and Ernie looked too, though both boys moved sluggishly as if they'd long before given up hope of getting free. Sarah entered, her purple cloak billowing dramatically around her narrowed body. "The children," she said, beaming, "are coming." Winifred clapped. "Well done, Sister Sarah." Danny tugged harder on her rope bindings, but it only seemed to brighten and tighten them. Behind her, she heard Binks wiggling in the woolen sack that Mary had swung from the mantel. He howled, and his claws scratched at the thick fabric. "Let me out of here," he demanded. "If I did, thou wouldst drop into the fire," chided Mary. "She's doing you a favor," Sarah agreed, pushing near the sack to give it a light pat where she thought Binks's head might be. She stuck out her head, but it only prompted a giggle from her currant-colored lips. The ballep caught Binks's claws and trapped them. As he struggled to rescue her paw, Sarah leaned in closer. "Sweet kitty," she cooed. Her nose nearly touched the burlap. "You'll make a good roast." She giggled again and turned away. Winifred finished tending the bubbling cauldron and moved instead to her book, which she returned to its ornate wooden stand. "Soon the lives of all thy little friends will be mine," she told Danny, "and I shall be young and beautiful again forever." "It doesn't matter how young and old you are," Danny spat back. "You sold your soul. You're the ugliest thing that's ever lived, and you know it." Winifred gave her a long, cold look. "You'll die first," she said crisply. She stalked back to the cauldron and bit off a chunk of her own tongue, spitting it into the potion while eyeing Danny. The liquid surface erupted with huge, hungry bubbles. Behind her, Ernie and Jay groaned. Danny's ears prickled at the crunch of tires on gravel. It was their parents' big car. She recognized the deep purr of the motor from many weekends spent lying awake, waiting for her parents to come back from friends' dinner parties. The thought made her remember those Saturday mornings with Max, when he'd order a pizza and help her with homework before starting his own. Sometimes he even give in when she begged him to watch Rescue Rangers or DuckTales with her instead of practicing his drums. Danny glanced at the Sanderson witches, but none of them seemed to hear the sound. Max was there to save her, she knew, and after he did, she'd never make him watch cartoons with her again unless she thought he secretly wanted to. Winifred gave a delighted yelp, snapping Danny's attention back to the horrors of hand. "'Tis ready!" the eldest witch said, giving the potion a final stir. "Pry open her mouth!" "Danny, don't drink it!" Binks called from his cloth prison. "Shut up, you!" said Winifred. She scooped up some bubbling liquid in her huge spoon. Sarah hurried over to Danny and pinched her jaw. Her fingers were surprisingly strong, but Danny kept her teeth tightly clenched. "Danny!" Binks shouted, unable to see what happening. "Don't drink it, Danny!" Mary went over to help her sister. She forced a thumb between Danny's lips, then sprang back. "Ow!" she shouted. "She bit me!" Danny brought her foot down hard on Sarah's toes. Though both of her sisters were anticipated, Winifred still advanced with her spoon. The door flew open, crashing into the wall. "Prepare to die!" shouted Max. "Again!" "Hollywood!" Jay said, jatting his chin at his cage's padlock. Winifred turned to Max. "You!" she said, splashing some of her potion in the process. It sizzled against the floorboards. "You have no powers here, you fool!" She refocused her attention on Danny. Meanwhile, Sarah had regained her footing and tried once more to force open Danny's mouth. Danny shut her head hard and squirmed, trying to protect her face from the witch's sharp nails. Winifred pressed her spoon against her mouth, putting it as close to the girl's nose as she could in the hopes that the petrol smell would force her to gasp or breathe through her mouth, swallowing the potent liquid in the process. Maybe not, Max said to Winifred, but there's power greater than your magic, and that's knowledge. And there's one thing I know that you don't. Winifred, frustrated, pulled the spoon away from Danny and whirled to Max. And what is that, dude? Her sisters concorded like ravens. Daylight savings time, he said. By the way, you changed your talk. Fall back this Saturday night. Mary parroted the strange phrase, mocking his accent. Sarah snorted. The orange light of sunrise pierced through the eastern windows of the house, shining warm and rosy, and sure enough, the glass. The riches shrank back. Max, get me out of here, Danny said desperately. At once, the Sanderson sisters collapsed onto the floor, wincing in pain. It hurts, Sarah shrieked. Max ran over and cut Danny's ties with his dad's pocket knife. Once freed, Jocelyn. Oh, goodness. Once freed. Danny jumped up and ran to the fireplace to save Binks. Hey, cried Jay. Let me out of here. Help! Max unlocked the bag containing Binks and handed it to Danny. Get outside, he said with a push to her shoulder. The witches continued to whimper underfoot. Winifred pulled her cloak over her face and hands to protect her skin. Hey, Hollywood, said Ernie. Max strode over and examined the bully, whose legs was dangling out of the cage. Help us out here, Ernie asked. Max pulled his stolen shoes from Ernie's feet. Tubular, he said, holding the Nikes up in salute. On his way to the door, he pushed over the cauldron, spilling the soul-sucking potion over the floor. It bobbled and mocked and smoked and spilled through the spaces between the floorboards as Winifred wailed. Let me out of here, man! Jay pleaded. Come on, Danny, Max said, taking Binks from her since she was struggling with the sack. Let's go. As they stepped out of the house, Danny stopped. Max, I want to see her turn to dust, she said. Just then, she spotted her mom's gray SUV. Allison was standing next to it, gesturing desperately at the headlights, which were covered in a colored film that turned their light orange. Pop it! Danny yelled, running for the car. Max followed her, ripping the cellophane from the headlights as he passed them. He jumped into the driver's seat, pushed Binks into Allison's arms, and revered the engine. The dawn thinned and vanished with a roar and a rumble. All right, now we're ready for Maggoty Maleficence. Let's start. Sarah rolled onto her back and stared at the high ceiling of the house she'd been born in. Firelight flickered over the sturdy, rough beams, highlighting swatches of cobwebs and colonies of spiders. She went through a mental checklist from the roots of her hair to the nails of her toes. Her hip hurt a little, but then again, she had fallen on it in her hurry to avoid the burning glint of sunrise. Everything else felt fine. I'm alive, she said, smiling. Damn that boy, said Winifred, who collapsed first and now laid beneath both Sarah and Mary. He tricked us again. She got clumsy to her feet. Her face was as red as her hair, Jocelyn. Oh, you're right, said Mary, shifting uncomfortably beneath Sarah's weight. You're always right. I don't know how to do that. It's my curse, said Winifred to Mary. That and you two. Get off of me, you thundering oafs! Sarah sprung up, dusted off her skirts, and pulled her lucky rat tail from her sleeve. Chewing it always made her feel better, especially when Winifred was out of sorts. Mary and Winifred scrambled up after her. Look, said Winifred. She crossed to the kitchen where the black flame candle waited on the cluttered counter. Its mysterious flame diminished to a weaker flicker. The scene on the outside of the candle had all but melted away, and the tamper was reduced to a runny stab. The candle is almost out, she said, then gained the courage to turn and examine the fallen cauldron and the paddled floorboards. And my potion, my beautiful potion! She knelt by the cauldron, not caring that the cooling liquid soaked her clothes. "Look!" she said. She knelt down even lower and peered into the depths of the pot. "There's just enough left for one child." The room seemed to grow very quiet, and the silence made Jay and Ernie even more suspicious. They were biting their lips and staring at each other, each wordlessly threatening mortal harm if the other made a sound. Winifred turned to Mary. "Get the vial," she said. Sarah took her a glass bottle whose base was wide and round and whose neck was long and thin. Carefully, Winifred laid the last of the potion into the bottle. She pressed the cork back into its mouth and clutched the treasure to her chest. "What luck!" she said, smiling. She turned to the door through which Max and Danny had escaped only minutes before, and her voice grew sharp. "This is perfect for that little tow-headed brat." "We have a child," said Sarah, gesturing at the two hanging cages. Jay and Ernie each pointed at each other, shouting, "Him!" Mary, for her part, leaned against the front window and watched the yard with dreamy interest. "And look, Winnie, more children are arriving." She had beckoned to the sleepwalkers. "Come on in," she cooed. "Winnie," Sarah said, touching her sister's forearm, "we'll make more potion because we have the book." She pointed to the spell book, which still laid open on the pedestal. "We haven't the time," said Winifred. "Besides, I want to get that little rat-faced kid that called me." "Oh," Mary said, rushing over. "Don't say it!" "Ugly?" asked Sarah. Winifred and Mary both cringed. "She really hurt my feelings," whimpered Winifred. "She doesn't even know me." She took Sarah's outstretched hand and dried her eyes on it. "You know," she said, composing herself, I always wanted a child, and now I think I'll have one. I'm toast!" Danny sat in the back of her parents' car, clenching Binks in her lap. Max was driving, which made her even more scared because his last practice session had ended on a long argument with their dad about what constituted as a rolling stop. "There are too many kids," Max said, careering around another group of transfixed children. He recognized a few of them from Danny's class and felt a pang of worry. He leaned out his window. "Go home," he shouted. But of course they didn't listen to him. They didn't even seem to hear him. Max groaned and pounded the steering wheel. "We need to wait in the cemetery until sunrise," he said, "but those zombie kids are going to trap us on the road." "Try that side road," Allison pointed off to the left, back into the woods. "It'll reconnect to the main road in town and you can circle around in front of the cemetery." Max nodded. He knew it was a risk since it would take longer, but he also knew that it would put them closer to the clearing Binks had showed them before. From there, it would be easier to see the witches coming and to go back into the sewers if needed. Before any other kids blocked their way, Max veered to the left as Allison suggested and headed deeper into the trees. He clenched his sweaty fist tighter around the steering wheel as visions of careering off the road swam through his head. The engine growled as he rolled the accelerator. The sparklers, the kin, the fake sunrise. How many times could they trick the witches before their tricks didn't work any longer? Max realized their time was running out, and so was the Sanderson sisters. If Allison was right, they just had to keep them at bay until sunrise. If Allison was right. Max glanced at her. "Are they following us?" he asked. Allison turned around in her seat. "No," she said. Max smiled. "Good." Just then, Winifred Sanderson appeared at the driver's side window, her body angled forward against the handle of her broom. Max swerved away but kept going, and Allison reached over to study the steering wheel and help ease back towards the middle of the road before it skidded off of it. "Pull over," Winifred demanded. "Let me see your driver's license." Max considered sticking his arm out the window to push her away, but there seemed like a terrible idea on several fronts. Instead, he gripped the wheel even tighter and banked the car to the left, knocking her and her broom out of the way. He grinned again, but this time he wiped his palms, one and then the other, on his jeans. "We're gonna be okay," Allison told him. He nodded tightly and pressed on, taking a sharp turn onto the street that held the graveyard entrance facing downtown Salem. He slammed on the brakes in the middle of the street and hopped out, not bothering to take the keys with him. Allison helped Danny and Binks out of the back seat before grabbing a packed duffel bag from the floor. The group hurried through the gate, breathing more easily once they were safe on hollowed ground. That is, until Max slammed into Billy Butcherson. Danny shrieked and Allison hurried back to help him, but Max shouted at them to go. Then he pulled out his dad's pocket knife. The girls were gone when Winifred arrived a second later, still clenching her broom. She floated near the top of the gate and shouted down at Billy, who was fighting Max for the knife. "Catch the children!" she said. Max winced as Billy overpowered him, forcing the knife closer and closer to Max's throat. Then Billy surprised him by levering Max's hand higher above his head. Billy sliced through the threads that sewed his mouth shut. He released Max then and gave a dry, grunted cough. Small brown moths flew from his lips and fluttered away. "Come now," Winifred ordered. "Kill him! Do it now!" "Rich!" Billy snapped at Winifred. "Trollop!" Max found this a bit rich, since Billy had been the one running around with his girlfriend's younger sister. "You buck-toothed, mouth-mopping, riding firefly from hell!" Winifred let out a scandalized screech. "I've waited centuries to say that," Billy told Max. "Say what you want," Max said, shrieking away. "Just don't breathe on me." "Billy," said Winifred, "I killed you once. I shall kill you again, you maggoty mouth Felicits." Billy grabbed Max around the waist and tugged, pulling both of them into the woods. "Hang on to your heads," Winifred called after them. Her taunt followed them, but she didn't bother flying over the graveyard gate, which worried Max. The witches had to be plotting something. It didn't take long for Max and Billy to find Allison and Danny in the clearing that housed Billy's open grave, which meant Max feared that it wouldn't take long for the witches to find them either. Allison and Danny scrambled up, each holding a sturdy branch. "Max, run!" shouted Danny. "Max, move out of the way!" said Allison, charging. Max threw himself between her and Billy. "Wait!" he said. "No, no, no, no! He's a good zombie." Allison gave the dead man a searching look. "You're sure?" she asked Max. "How do I know you're not just saying that because you've been bitten?" Max gave her a look and Allison relented. "Okay, fine." Billy followed the pair down the low hill toward both Danny and her own open grave. "Hi, Billy," Danny said, waving. Max looked at her face. Her fear was gone, and she seemed to think the idea of befriending a zombie was totally reasonable. Was she so adaptable because she was still a kid? He couldn't remember even being like that. Maybe she really did have a thing or two to teach him. He hoped they'd all survive the night so that she could. Billy helped Danny into the grave. "You'll be safe in here," he said. Max dug through their duffel bag of surprises and supplies. He handed Allison a fresh carton of salt and pulled out a baseball bat for himself. "You okay, Danny?" he asked his sister. "Yeah," she said in a small voice. "I'm fine." Adaptable or not, she was still his sister, and they both knew she was still in danger. He adjusted his grip on the bat and practiced swinging a few times. Allison opened the salt container and drew a circle of it around the grave. "Here they come," said Binks, who was perched on the headstone. "Billy, guard Danny. Max and Allison, spread out." They'd just taken their places when Winifred descended from the dark sky. Her dress and robes fluttered around her, caught by a light autumn wind. "For the last time," she said, "prepare to meet thy doom." She swooped low, heading for Danny. Max took a swing at her with a baseball bat. Winifred veered to the side, cluckling, and then course-corrected. This time, she bore down on Max. "You little pest," she said to him. "I've had enough of you." He swung at her again, but Winifred grabbed the bat from his hands and flung it away, chortling. Max made to run then, but Winifred was a step ahead. She opened her palm, and a branch of electricity ripped out in her skin and made contact with the nearest tree, right at the point between its trunk and heaviest branch. Danny screamed as the branch toppled down, blocking Max's path and separating him from his friends. Billy, who stood between Danny and the witch, glowered at Winifred. "Go to hell," he said. The eldest Sanderson smiled tightly. "Oh, I've already been there, thank you," she said. "I found it quite lovely. And now it's time for hallowed ground." Sarah and Mary, the first on a rotty mop and the second on an upright vacuum, drove toward Max and Allison. Max fled to the right and Allison to the left, splitting up the two witches as they scrabbled into the woods and tried to seek shelter among the trees. Winifred crackled, pleased that her sisters had followed her instructions for once. Billy took a step closer to her. He looked as if he was going to say something else, spiteful, but Winifred gave another sharp laugh before diving straight toward him. Danny, hidden in the open grave, gave a frightened warning shout, and Billy lifted his arms to grab for Winifred's broom handle, but he missed. Winifred pulled up to the last moment and thrust her legs forward, kicking him in the jaw. His head flew off for the second time that night and bounced and rolled to a stop several feet away. In the woods, Allison slipped behind a huge pine tree as Sarah turned a corner and waited there until she was sure she was safe. After a few heart-stopping seconds of ducking and waving, Max dove under a half-collapsed tree and waited in the leaves until Mary swept past, calling out, "Sister Sarah! I lost our dinner!" From her safe spot in Billy's grave, Danny peeked out from between her fingers when Winifred left to track down her sisters, who were waving through the woods, calling for Allison and Max. Danny dragged herself out of the grave and hurried over to rescue Billy's head. And Max and Allison stumbled out of the woods at the same time and spotted each other from across the clearing. Max lifted his chin in recognition and then headed straight for Billy Butcherson's grave. He froze so suddenly, Allison almost crashed into him from behind. Danny had disappeared. Allison spotted Danny first and tugged on Max's sleeve. The youngest Denison was several yards away. She'd griggily picked up Billy's head and was offering it to his body, which was desperately shuffling through the leaves and sticks. "I think you dropped this," she said. As Billy reattached his head, everyone heard a familiar shout. Winifred reemerged from the woods, her sisters at her heels, and she aimed her broom handle straight toward Danny and Billy. And before Max could run or shout or even blink, Winifred had his little sister around the middle and was lifting her into the sky. Billy, Max, and Allison took off after them, while Binks watched helplessly from where he stood before a gravestone. "Bye-bye, big brother," called Winifred over her shoulder. She pulled from her robes a glass bulb filled with green liquid, and then she looked at Danny and gritted her teeth. "All right, you little troll-a-mog." Sarah and Mary waited some distance away, celebrating their sister's success by spinning in wild circles on their mop and vacuum, fingers barely touching. "Hold on, Danny!" called Binks, dashing over rocks and gravestones in her direction. Winifred bit down on the bottle's cork and yanked it from the neck of the bottle. She spread it onto the ground. "This will teach you to call people ugly," she said. "Open your mouth!" Binks ran up the sturdy branch Winifred had torn down only minutes before. He leaped from his highest point and knocked the vial from her hand. As Winifred reached for it, he clawed at her face and arms until she flung it away. Binks gave a yell as he hit the ground, but he was on his feet in a moment, trembling and scrambling to shelter in the underbrush. The potion bottle tumbled end over end as it fell. But somehow not a drop of liquid spilled. Max caught the bottle. White smoke bubbled out of the top, smelling of saltwater taffy and palm scum. "Give me that vial," said Winifred. Max held it over his head. "Put her down or I'll smash it." "Smash it," said Winifred, "and she dies." Allison called her name and tried to run over to him, but Billy pulled her back. Jocelyn. "He's got a plan," Billy whispered to her, "I think." Max glared at Winifred. She said she would kill his sister if he broke the bottle, but he knew that if he handed it over, she'll just kill her anyway, slowly sucking out Danny's life force in front of him, just like Binks had told him they had done to his poor sister Emily. He couldn't be the one to sentence his own sister to that, but he could do it to himself. He lifted the bottle to his lips and took a long swig, swallowing the whole thing. He bubbled and burned as it went down his throat. "Max, no!" shouted Danny, but it was too late. Sarah and Mary froze, shocked by the turn of events. They waited for Winifred's reaction. Winifred gasped, recoiling as if she'd been burned. Max smashed the empty body across a nearby tombstone and glared up at the eldest Sanderson. "Now you have no choice," he said. "You have to take me." Winifred descended slowly. "What a fool you are to give up thy life for thy sisters." When Mary and Sarah heard Winifred's words, the two of them exchanged a look. As she neared the groan, Winifred released Danny and grabbed Max's collar instead. Danny collapsed, sobbing, and Billy and Allison hurried to help her up. Winifred, who was surprisingly strong, lifted Max by only his shirt. His body had begun to glow, letting off a golden perescent sheen that moved when he moved, but as a more leanishly rate. Winifred brought Max's face close to hers and opened her mouth. A narrow stream of light peeled off from the rest of him and coursed past her lips and down her throat. Max's eyes grew wide, for he could feel the draining sensation somewhere in his chest. He felt also that he was growing older, as if each second were a lost year. The world suddenly wasn't so funny anymore. Distantly, he could hear Allison and Danny screaming, but he didn't know what to do about it. For some reason, all he can think of was the red plastic car he'd gotten for his 4th or 5th birthday. He raced around in it, pedaling the thing with his feet like a Flintstone and shouting that he'd be a race car driver one day. Jocelyn. Then he thought of the day Danny had been born and how his father had put the small sparkling pink thing in his arms and told him that now he had responsibilities. And he looked at his baby sister and felt a warm, comfortable weight settled around his shoulders. He thought of meeting Jack and of hearing the Ramones for the first time and of screaming at his parents when they sat him down and explained that his dad had taken a job on the East Coast in Salem, Massachusetts. And they thought of Allison and her vases and her laugh and then her conversation in the sewers. And when she told him she liked him better when he was around Danny and how he realized that maybe he liked himself better then too. Max reached up and pushed Winifred's face away. She swatted his hand at first, but he tried again with as much force as he could muster. As she turned her face away and had to close her mouth, and the remainder of Max's life force cleansed back around his body. Having it close to his skin made him feel more solid and more aware of his surroundings. This gave Max an idea, and he heaved his whole body toward Winifred, scrambling at her throat and digging his thumbs into the hollow of it. The witch gagged and pushed back at him, finally shoving him hard enough that he almost fell. He had left clinging to the handle of her broom for only his fingers. Max pulled down hard, flipping the broom, and suddenly Winifred was unseated and hanging by only her fingers too, scrambling to get a better hold on the prickly bristles. "Hallowed ground!" she said desperately, looking down. "Hallowed ground, sisters!" "Winnie!" called Mary. "I'm coming!" The Barrett witch sailed over the other children, not realizing that her vacuum cleaner's cord was dangling within their reach. Danny grabbed it by the plug and dug her heels into the soft earth. Allison and Billy anchored themselves to the cord too. Mary only made it a few more feet before the cord stopped her from going any further. She looked over her shoulder and let out a strangling cry when she realized what had gone wrong. They only made Allison and Billy and Danny pull harder on the line. "I'm going to teach you a lesson you'll never forget," Winifred said to Max as they both struggled to pull themselves back onto the broom. They spun and sprung like a top as in the east a sliver of orange light broke the horizon. Winifred pulled herself back onto the broom, but the promise of sunrise gave Max a sudden burst of energy. He just had to wait for it to reach his tingling fingers. "Sarah!" Mary pleaded, still struggling against the spiteful humans trying to drag her onto the graveyard soil. Beneath her, the vacuum writhed and wind. Sarah flew down and gasped her sister's hand, tugging, but Billy and Allison and Danny had better leverage. With her tug, they pulled Mary a little closer to the ground. "Let go! Now!" shouted Allison. They all did it once, and the released tension sent Mary and Sarah spinning through the air. Winifred watched her sisters arc over the treetops, trying desperately to right themselves. So she didn't notice when Max swung his body around and put all his weight into knocking her from her place on the broom. She hit the ground with a heavy thud. Max dropped down a few feet away, panting. Winifred roared as she turned over and began to crawl toward him. Her movements were stiff and labored, though, as if each additional pull of muscle and twist of tendon was more and more difficult to control. Her long nails, as sharp and hooked as claws, dug into the earth each time she planted her heels, and each time she pulled them back, earth and grass flew up and muddled her palms and wrists. Max pushed himself away from her, but he was so tired. Glow light shimmered before his eyes. At last, Winifred grabbed him by the front of his sweater and lifted him up, struggling with her own aching hips as she stood. She opened her mouth to suck the life from him, but when Max looked down, he saw that the curled toes of her boots had begun to smoke and harden into granite. The stone crackled over her skin from the soles of her feet to her calves and knees and stomach and shoulders and head, until Max found himself dangling from the gasping fingers of a furious statue. He wiggled about, ripping himself free. He grunted when he hit the ground, but the gold halo surrounding his body faded as the sun fully broke over Salem Harbor. A scrap of his shirt hung from Winifred Stone's talons, flittering meekly like a flag of surrender. Above the graveyard, Sarah gave a squeak before bursting into a cloud of purple glitter. Mary's jaw dropped open just as she exploded in a firework of red smoke. Their mop and vacuum hit the ground with two distinct thuds. Winifred's statue began to quiver and then crack, and with a burst, it blew apart, lighting up the world briefly with a lime green glow. Jocelyn. Max sucked in a disbelieving breath and collapsed onto his back. For a moment, his entire world consisted of his pattering heart, the sweet relief swimming through his head, and morning's gray light. And now, to the end of Hocus Pocus. Love you, jerk face. Max, from his place on the ground, buried his face in both arms. "Max!" called a tentative voice, but he was still dazed and didn't know how to answer. Instead, he heaved himself into a sitting position and looked around at the clearing, where nothing had changed and everything had changed. The witches were gone, but there had been witches. He was alive, but he nearly had his essence drained out through his pores. And Danny, he said, turning to try to find his sister. She was dashing down the low hill toward him. "Max!" she said, kneeling beside him. He thought he'd never hear her sound quite so gentle. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he croaked. "I think so." You saved my life, she said. He looked at her small, surprised face. Well, I had to. I'm your big brother. She beamed. I love you, jerk face, she said. I love you too. She drew her arms around his neck and he wrapped one of his own around her back. Come on, Danny said after a few seconds. She helped him to his feet and led him to Billy's grave. Winifred's ex was already climbing back into his broken coffin. Allison walked over and slipped her arm around Max's shoulder. She felt solid and stable and real in a way that still seemed to escape the rest of the graveyard, and even Danny, who was helping Billy get settled in his coffin. Max was his free arm around Allison's waist. It all really happened, didn't it? He asked her. She squeezed his arm. Yeah, she said. The black flame candle, the Sanderson Sisters, his almost kiss with Allison in his parents' still-packed kitchen, Binks and Billy and Danny's kidnap and rescue, and Max's own life drifting to a witch's angry mouth before his eyes. All of it was real. Despite how unbelievable the night had been, Allison made him feel grounded just by standing near him. In fact, having Allison so close made Max think that he could take on the world, at least if he was with her. He looked back at the broken remains of Winifred's statue and realized that maybe they already had. And maybe they would have to again, but it wouldn't be so scary the second time around. Bye, Billy, Danny said as he reached for his coffin's lid. Have a nice sleep. Hey, Billy, called Max. Billy Butcherson paused and gave Max an expectant look. Thanks, Max said. Allison waved goodbye with a small smile on her face. Billy waved in return, then stretched his whole body with a big yawn and dropped back into the remains of his bed. Danny looked around. Binks, she said. Where's Binks? She broke away from Max to track down the cat, but what she found brought her to her knees. No! She said, gasping. Binks's body laid still and lifeless at the foot of a leafless tree. He's gone, Danny, Allison said softly. But he can't die, remember? Danny touched his narrow shoulder. Binks, she said. Binks, wake up, like last time. When he didn't move, she broke into a fresh wave of sobbing. Come on, said Binks's voice, though it wasn't coming from the cat. Please don't be sad for me. Allison, Max, and Danny all looked around. A few feet away stood a young man, likely Max's age, wearing a billowing white tunic that was open at the collar. The warm light of a daybreak filtered through his skin and clothes as if he wasn't entirely there. Binks, is that you? Danny asked. Yeah, said the ghost. His dark blonde hair was pulled back and tied in a short tail, and he was smiling. The witches are dead. My soul's finally free. Danny took a step forward. You freed me, Danny, Binks said. Thank you. He looked from her to her brother. Hey, Max, he added. Thanks for lighting the candle. Max snorted. Anytime. Thackeray! The asker was a semi-translucent little girl in a white dress and white cap. She peered around the trunk of a tall tree. Thackeray Binks, she called. It's Emily, said Binks, looking back at his new friends and smiling. He leaned down and gave Danny a kiss on the cheek. I shall always be with you, he whispered. Danny nodded, and with that, Binks took off and joined his little sister, hugging her and then taking her by the hand. Thackeray Binks, what took you so long? She asked, gazing up at him. I'm sorry, Emily, he said. The pair walked off toward the sunrise in the direction of the large iron gates to the cemetery. I had to wait 300 years for a virgin to light a candle. As Max, Allison, and Danny watched them go, Max placed a hand on Danny's shoulder and pulled her a little closer to him. He'd never forget Binks's caution to look after her. The figures of Thackeray and Emily dissolved into light and shadow and trick of the sun through autumn leaves, and Max crouched to give Danny a hug. She giggled before pushing him away. So, said Allison, bumping Max with her hip, did I make a believer out of you? They both laughed. Yeah, said Max, I guess so. It was hard to tell who started the kiss or how long it lasted, but as soon as they came up for air, they dove back in, and Max cupping Allison's face in both of his hands and Allison pulling him closer by the hem of his sweater. Danny gave them a few seconds of privacy before clearing her throat loudly. Can we go home? She asked. I'm tired and I haven't gotten a single piece of candy tonight. Max laughed and pushed her ahead of him as they all headed back to the family car. Sure thing, kid, he said. I'm glad you saved me, Max, said Danny, as if she'd actually been debating the pros and cons. Now I get to bug you for years and years. Allison laughed hard at that, which made Danny laugh too. Max knitted his fingers through Allison's as they followed Danny to the graveyard gate. Can't wait, he said. And he meant it. Jay and Ernie swung in their cages, waiting for someone to come save them. They hung in rounds to pass the time and moved wordlessly and listily, waiting for a painful process, but they held out hope that someone would come for them. Meanwhile, on its podium, Winifred's spellbook slowly opened its eyes and looked around, feeling the loss of its master. But then it rose into the air. Jay and Ernie screamed and shook the bars of their cages at the strange light. The book soared out of the window and into the early morning light. It floated above the cemetery and through the town square, passing the crowd of adults who filed stumbling out of town hall after a night of endless dancing. It continued flying higher and higher, seeking its master. And it wouldn't stop until it found her. And that is the end of Hocus Pocus. Now there's a part 2, but we're not going to read that. But I'd like to think that the part 2 is just like Hocus Pocus 2. So if you enjoyed that, go and watch it. Now, as I like to say, happy Halloween as we are posting it today. And have a blessed week. And I will post again this Friday, and we will be back on track with another story time with Jocelyn. Bye-bye.